Mises probably met Robbins for the first time in the fall of 1924. In October of that year, he wrote to Gustav Fischer that he had received a very serious offer for an English translation of the second part of Gemeinwirtschaft from a Mr. Robbins, a tutor of economics in Oxford. Robbins turned out to be Robbins, and he came highly recommended. He had just accepted a temporary position at Oxford University until 1929. He would alternate between positions at Oxford and LSE. During the next few years, he worked on a translation of Gemeinwirtschaft, Socialism, and later initiated a translation of Mises' Theorie des Geldes und der Umlaufsmittel, Theory of Money and Credit. These projects slowed significantly after 1926, when Robbins was charged with various administrative duties at LSE, to the point that he brought in a co-translator. But his interest in Austrian economics, and especially in the work of Mises, grew constantly. At the beginning of the 1930s, the contacts between Vienna and London had matured to such an extent that Mises and his students were frequent guest lecturers at LSE. The blossoming of Austrian economics in Britain culminated when F.R. Hayek eventually became professor of economics at the London School of Economics in the fall of 1931. Advent of the gold exchange standard. It did not take quite as long to find a solution to Austria's post-war financial calamities. The first real breakthrough came at a conference that took place in the fall of 1922 in Genoa, and led to the signing of a convention in Geneva on October 4, 1922. The so-called Geneva Protocol was the last in a series of negotiations that had begun at the end of 1921, when Austria was promised loans from the British, French, Czechs, and Italians. The condition was that the Austrian government had to grant institutionalized supervision inside of Austria, and to pledge some of its income and assets to the foreign creditors. These conditions were at first unacceptable to the Austrian Chancellor, Johann Schober, but time was running out. The only alternative to foreign loans was increased taxation and inflation, and these options were even less acceptable. The Social Democrats virulently opposed any more taxation of the general population. They were still advocating a special tax on wealth, always a popular proposal, but incapable of balancing the budget. And more inflation would certainly bring monetary breakdown and ensuing civil chaos. A turning point was reached when, at the end of May 1922, Monsignor Ignaz Seipel assumed the chancellorship with a firm resolution to lead Austria out of the financial nightmare. He already had some experience in handling catastrophic situations in Austrian politics, having been a member of the last imperial government under Heinrich Lammasch in 1918. A Catholic priest, Seipel was not a man to despair over the unpopularity of the decisions that needed to be made. Living in a Vienna monastery, he was not as exposed as were his other party comrades to the many temptations of personal friendship and the spotlight of fame. Himself a monarchist, his great achievement was to reconcile Austrian Catholicism with the Republic, and thus to spare Austria the fate of other countries, such as France, Italy, and Spain, where after the establishment of the Republic the political right split into conservative monarchists and Republican Democrats. He knew that reliance on international loans under the conditions spelled out by Western creditors was a dangerous strategy because it would lead his country into dependence on foreign powers. But there was no alternative if the goal was to rid the country of the poison of inflation. Mises and his friend Wilhelm Rosenberg convinced Seipel of the necessity of this reform. With candid foresight, they stressed that the reform was bound to produce a crisis. There would be massive unemployment, and other interests would be hurt as well. This crisis would merely bring to light the damage already done by the previous inflation, but public opinion would blame the reformer. Seipel appreciated the frankness of his advisers. Mises later recalled, "He adopted fully my ideas about sound money, and I cooperated with him." Seipel's economic and political views were of course shaped to a large extent by prevailing Catholic moral views on social organization, in particular by Pope Leo VIII encyclical Rerum Novarum, 1891. He was also known as a sharp critic of radical anti-Semitism. In his eyes, the Austrian Jews were a national minority and should enjoy all minority rights. In the same month, Mises was appointed the president of the Bureau for Claims Settlements. The former director, Mises' friend Emil Peros, moved on to another position. he was appointed director of the Kreditinstitut für öffentliche Arbeiten, Credit Institute for Public Works. In one of his first actions, after his initial orientation, Seipel dealt a heavy blow to Austria's inflation party, which had its stronghold in the Austro-Hungarian Bank. Following the stipulations of Article 206 of the Treaty of Saint-Germain, he abolished the old central bank and established a new one, under the leadership of Richard Reich, a former student of Karl Menger's and a civil servant under bohm-bawerk in the Ministry of Finance. At the time of his appointment to the presidency of the new central bank, he had just been appointed a vice president under Mises at the Bureau for Claims Settlements. Seipel's reforms hurt those groups whose incomes had been paid out of the inflation, in particular the nationalized industries and socialist municipal governments that had started creating expensive welfare programs immediately after the war, programs that could only be paid for through the printing press of the Austro-Hungarian Bank. Hurting these interests entailed only moderate political costs for the government and might have even been a welcome side effect of Seipel's reform in that it promised to hurt groups that were part of the socialist opposition. It turned out, however, that the very success of the reform extended the survival of these groups. The stable monetary framework attracted a great volume of foreign credit to Austria, which was then used to finance local welfare schemes. The reform did visibly curtail Austrian sovereignty in financial and economic matters. Seipel's government accepted the establishment of the office of a Kommissar General, who henceforth controlled Austria's public finance. This action effectively surrendered control over Seipel's budget to the Entente-controlled League of Nations. Dr. Alfred Zimmermann, a former mayor of Rotterdam, was appointed Kommissar General and stayed for 3 years in Vienna. With Austria colonized, its government is subject to foreign powers. The Socialists did not hesitate to accuse Seipel of giving up the country's sovereignty. The German nationalists in Seipel's coalition saw things the same way. Mises had been one of the driving forces behind the reform. He thought Austria could have done without the 650 million kronen of credit, but not without the Kommissar. Austrian politicians needed a fall guy to take responsibility for unpopular policies. He did not exactly have a high opinion of Zimmermann himself, but had great respect for Chief Executive Hans Patzauer, a civil servant from the Ministry of Finance. Mises was widely perceived as enjoying very good ties to Patzauer. This working relation turned him into a power broker. For example, the leadership of the University of Vienna sought his advice, lobbying with Patzauer, whenever it planned an increase of its budget. The Geneva Conference had not only provided a solution for Austrian financial calamities, but it also paved the way for the so-called gold exchange standard. In the 1870s, an international monetary system had emerged that covered the entire Western world and its colonies, the classical gold standard. The money of this system was gold, but in most cases the currency, that is, the means of payment that actually circulated in the countries taking part in the system, were the fractional reserve notes of the various national central banks. In many countries, most notably in Russia, Austria-Hungary, and India, the national currency was backed up not only by physical gold in the vaults of the central bank, but also by other gold-denominated currencies. This practice of holding both gold and gold-denominated foreign banknotes became known as the gold exchange standard when it became standard procedure in the interwar period. Some Austrians then claimed the new international system had been invented by their finance minister Steinbach in 1897. In fact, however, the system was devised by David Ricardo in proposals for an economical and secure currency. During the war, most countries had abandoned the classical gold standard to finance war expenditure through inflation. After the war, many statesmen promoted the re-establishment of an international gold standard, but the accumulated war debts were so huge that redemption at pre-war parities would have ruined most governments. On the other hand, these same governments did not wish to create the correct impression that they had cheated their creditors and could not fulfill their promises. The natural solution in this context was the adoption of the gold exchange standard. The advantage of this system was that a central bank could minimize its non-interest-bearing gold holdings by trusting other central banks, which held the physical gold needed for redemption. The disadvantages were not as apparent before the First World War. It made redemption more uncertain than it had been under the classical fractional reserve gold standard, and because it made redemption dependent on a prior redemption in some other country, it gave political leverage to these foreign central banks. The Banque de France acquired a reputation for its ruthlessness in using this leverage. The first steps toward the creation of the International Gold Exchange Standard were made at the Geneva Conference in the fall of 1922. Here the representatives of the major central banks agreed to cooperate more closely. The idea was to help out central banks that were unable to redeem their notes, as well as, more generally, to coordinate central bank policies. A few years later, Mises stated in plain language what coordination meant. The coordinated central banks would increase their note issues in concert, thus avoiding the embarrassment of the falling exchange rates that inevitably result from unilateral inflation. Coordination of national inflation policies in order to suppress one of the main symptoms of monetary decay has remained the state of the art to this day. For debtors in a very inflationary currency area, cooperation between the central banks is a boon. Without foreign assistance, the exchange rate of their currency would constantly fall, and thus it would be next to impossible to obtain foreign credit. Central bank cooperation solves this problem, at the expense of creditors or would-be debtors in the more stable countries. In the 1920s, this mechanism worked to the advantage of the most ruthless debtors, the socialist municipal and provincial governments in Austria and Germany. Mises took part in expert meetings at the Finance Ministry discussing the implications of the Geneva Protocol for Austria. The Western loans had given Seipel's government some flexibility in the short run, and the inflation was under control. Starting in September 1922, the exchange rate stabilized around 70,000 kronen per dollar. But in the longer run, economic stability and Austrian political independence could only be gained if the budget was balanced without inflation. Large increases of government income were not to be expected because the economy was still in a slump, and a quick recovery was out of the question given the prohibitive trade barriers erected by neighboring countries. The only way out was to cut government spending. The largest expenses were the heavy food price subsidies and the payments for the huge deficits of the railroads and the post office. The government had a tobacco monopoly and one for salt, but the receipts were meagre. But these were sacred cows of the Socialists, and Seipel did not dare touch them for fear of a violent reaction from the opposition, especially because unemployment would rise quickly. From the end of August till the end of December 1922, the number of unemployed receiving government assistance in the city of Vienna alone rose from 24,000 to 58,000. On February 24, 1923, there were 112,000 unemployed in Vienna and the surrounding districts, of whom 98,000 received government assistance. See Mises's undated letter to an unknown recipient. This document summarizes Mises's view on economic conditions in Austria in early 1923. Mises wrote it in reply to an unknown Anglo-Saxon friend who had visited Vienna sometime earlier. Throughout 1923, unemployment was at 110,000. It would further increase over the following years, reaching some 200,000 by 1929. He therefore put all his hopes into reducing government expenditure by dismissing 50,000 civil servants. Eventually the tension in the Austrian budget was reduced through this process. The stabilization of the krone and the virtual dependence of Austrian finance on foreign supervision had reinforced the creditworthiness of Austrian debtors, and especially of Austrian local governments. This tendency was reinforced by those agreements of the Geneva Conference that paved the way for the gold exchange standard, and it was further reinforced by the onset of the great U.S. inflation of 1920, which came into full swing by early 1923. The United States had overcome a minor post-war depression in 1920-1921. Austrian institutions now benefited from a near-limitless inflow of new loans. This gave a further boost to the ambitious spending plans of the Austrian socialists, particularly in Red Vienna. American funds financed one of the great experiments of communal socialism. Within a decade, Vienna was turned into a miniature nanny state designed to provide for the needs of the working class from cradle to grave. One mayor of Vienna boasted in Mises's presence, "The Viennese is born into social democracy. He lives in it and dies as he has lived." To the great dismay of the social bystanders, Mises replied with the Vienna proverb, "Some say that even the owners of 4-story houses are mortal." The new U.S. loans also supported the violent class struggle of the Vienna trade unions, which relied on the social infrastructure paid for out of the new public funds. A document from the time describes the situation from the perspective of Austrian firms. As a consequence of the terror of the free trade unions, that is, of the social democratic trade unions, the situation in the factories had become unsupportable. The free trade unions forced the non-social democratic workers under threats to join their organizations and to contribute to their various funds. Threatening strikes, they forced the entrepreneurs to recognize their organizations as the only representatives of the interests of the worker classes. They prevented the employment of workers with other political orientations, and even demanded that these persons be fired. Thus, thousands of workers were condemned to unemployment. The Christian Socialists sought to introduce legislation outlawing the terror of the trade unions, but the Social Democratic parliamentarians vetoed all such measures. The credit-fueled increase of government power also had a profound impact on the traditional Austrian conflict between industrial and agrarian interests. Austria's conservative landed establishment came under pressure from two sides. While the imports of agrarian products from Hungary and other neighboring countries reduced the price of their products, the Austrian industries had an ever higher demand for workers and attracted former peasants through higher wages. To counter these trends, the landed interests sought to have the government protect them through tariffs and monopolies, and they sought, unsuccessfully of course, to strike a backroom deal with big industrialists, pointing out that a stable agrarian sector was the backbone of the conservative order. The more peasants were drawn into industrial occupations, the more they would come under the spell of Marxist organizations and Marxist culture. It was therefore in the interest of Austria's industrialists, according to the landowners, not to compete for the agrarian workforce. A very similar, though less dramatic, development took place in other European countries. The general scheme was always the same. Wartime inflation had been perpetuated after the end of the hostilities to finance the growth of the welfare state and to cover the deficits of nationalized industries. The governments of Germany and Russia had pursued this dangerous policy up to the bitter end of hyperinflation and the collapse of the monetary system. The other governments were less reckless, but still followed the same strategy, which they only abandoned once foreign loans, especially from the United States, became available on a large scale in the framework of the emerging gold exchange standard. At that point, they shifted from inflation to debt. With the help of the United States, Europe's initial problem, the lack of discipline to curtail government deficits, grew worse over the years, reproducing itself, as the Marxists say, on a higher scale. Mises repeatedly denounced this practice in the midst of the Roaring Twenties, in a lecture on the therapy of European public finance, which he delivered on February 27, 1925, to the Hungarian Cobden Association in Budapest. He pointed out that halting the inflation was not enough. The Major Cobden Szövetség, Hungarian Cobden Association, was a group of free market businessmen, economists, and journalists in Budapest. Before Mises, Sombart, Oppenheimer, Rist, and George Peisch had spoken at its meetings. They were all received in the most luxurious conditions, Hotel Ritz, and were probably very well paid as well. One of Mises's main contacts in Budapest was a certain Felix Schwarz, who was no academic. Schwarz visited regularly with Mises in Vienna and had contacts with the Pestalozzi, a Budapest journal that frequently ran reviews of Mises's books. It was only the beginning, not the end, of monetary and financial reform. What was needed was a radical reduction of the expenditure side of the government's budget. It was an error to start the reform of public finance by firing officers. One should have begun by reducing the superfluous government agendas, most of all by reducing government businesses. And he stressed that it was, in particular, the large issues of bonds which enabled the governments and local administration to realize their plans for nationalization and communalization of industry, culture, and infrastructure. The seemingly unlimited availability of ever more foreign credit created the impression that the government had endless resources. The demands for government support and the confidence in government omnipotence waxed limitless. The Roaring Twenties set the stage for the roaring dictators of the 30s. Hyperinflation, currency competition, and monetary reform. Meanwhile, the Verein für Sozialpolitik had put the problem of monetary stabilization on the agenda for its 1923 meeting. Mises had been invited to write one of the expert reports to serve as the basis for the discussions, an unexpected sign of attention. Many years later he wrote, "When my money book appeared in the year 1912, all German reviewers rejected it with very unfriendly words. It was only due to the monetary collapse, which destroyed much more than the monetary system, that, when the currency catastrophe approached, even the Verein für Sozialpolitik had second thoughts and asked me, rather than Knapp or Ben Dixon, to write a report on the problems of monetary stabilization, and that the second edition of my book in 1924 had a much better reception." He later recalled that his monetary theories have been studied only when and where inflationist policies faced immediate collapse, such as in the German Reich. The most fashionable book on money in the years before 1923 was written by Albert Hahn, a young economist in Frankfurt, developing Schumpeter's theory of capital, in which capital was abstract purchasing power. Hahn stressed that fiduciary credit expansion had the beneficial effect of creating forced savings, and thus higher growth rates than could be obtained without inflation. In his book he anticipated virtually all the essential propositions of Keynes's general theory, 1936. Albert Hahn, Volkswirtschaftliche Theorie des Bankkredits. Hahn eventually changed his mind under the impact of the German hyperinflation and of criticism, most notably from Hayek and other members of the Austrian school. Still later, he wrote a piece comparing his 1920 statement with the corresponding passages in John Maynard Keynes's general theory of employment, interest, and money. But in 1923, the German economists started having second thoughts about the blessings of inflation. They wished to listen again to the voice of dissent. At the end of February 1923, Mises submitted his manuscript, Die geldtheoretische Seite des Stabilisierungsproblems, the problem of stabilization considered from the point of view of monetary theory. This title is somewhat misleading. In fact, the essay combines a sophisticated analysis of what today would be called the dynamics of currency competition, with the first concise statement of Mises's ideas on how to prepare for the transition from an inflationary currency to the gold standard. The essay was one of Mises's most influential works, in the sense that it had an immediate and noticeable impact on the economic policy of the German Reich. Mises began by pointing out that continued inflation would necessarily end up in the collapse of the monetary system. In recent months, the German Reich has provided a rough picture of what must happen once the people come to believe that the course of monetary depreciation is not going to be halted. If people are buying unnecessary commodities, or at least commodities not needed at the moment, because they do not want to hold on to their paper notes, then the process, which forces the notes out of use as a generally acceptable medium of exchange, has already begun. This is the beginning of the demonetization of the notes. The panicky quality inherent in the operation must speed up the process. It may be possible to calm the excited masses once, twice, perhaps even 3 or 4 times. However, matters must finally come to an end. Then there is no going back. Once the depreciation makes such rapid strides that sellers are fearful of suffering heavy losses, even if they buy again with the greatest possible speed, there is no longer any chance of rescuing the currency. That the German mark is still used as money today, January 1923, is due simply to the fact that the belief generally prevails that its progressive depreciation will soon stop, or perhaps even that its value per unit will once more improve. The moment that this opinion is recognized as untenable, the process of ousting paper notes from their position as money will begin. If the process can still be delayed somewhat, it can only denote another sudden shift of opinion as to the state of the mark's future value. The phenomena described as frenzied purchases have given us some advance warning as to how the process will begin. It may be that we shall see it run its full course. And indeed it did run its full course, at least as far as Germany was concerned. The process accelerated with exponential growth rates during 1923, culminating in the virtual collapse of the currency in October. In the fall of 1923, the Reichsbank operated some 1,700 printing presses 24 hours a day, and had used the entire production of 30 paper factories. Eventually, the paper supply threatened to become a bottleneck. For some time, Mises had to fear that his essay would not be published in time to influence policy. In May, he wrote to the publisher expressing his misgivings about the delay. The delay was caused by the other contributor to the volume, ex-Minister Klein, who was unable to return his proof pages in the agreed time. Publications of the Verein für Sozialpolitik were usually meant to have an impact on current policy. In his essay, Mises discussed two scenarios of the displacement of the inflationary currency. Either this process can occur in a panic such that the bad money is abandoned in a few days or even in a few hours, or the currency substitution takes place relatively slowly, thus assuring a smoother transition. Mises had first-hand experience of the slower process. The description given in his essay fits observations he made during the high post-war inflation in Vienna. The practice of making and settling domestic transactions in foreign money or in gold, which has already reached substantial proportions in many branches of business, is being increasingly adopted. As a result, to the extent that individuals shift more and more of their cash holdings from German marks to foreign money, still more foreign exchange enters the country. As a result of the growing demand for foreign money, various kinds of foreign exchange equivalent to a part of the value of the goods shipped abroad are imported instead of commodities. Gradually, there is accumulated within the country a supply of foreign monies. This substantially softens the effects of the final breakdown of the domestic paper standard. Then, if foreign exchange is demanded even in small transactions, if, as a result, even wages must be paid in foreign exchange, at first in part and then in full, if finally even the government recognizes that it must do the same when levying taxes and paying its officials, the sums of foreign money needed for these purposes are, for the most part, already available within the country. The situation which emerges from the collapse of the government's currency does not necessitate barter, the cumbersome direct exchange of commodities against commodities. Foreign money from various sources then performs the service of money, even if somewhat unsatisfactorily. Mises contrasted this smooth transition with the panic scenario, which, as he said, was more likely in the context of the 1923 German inflation. Things will necessarily be much worse if the breakdown of the paper money does not take place step by step, but comes, as now seems likely, all of a sudden in panic. The supplies within the country of gold and silver money and of foreign notes are insignificant. The practice pursued so eagerly during the war of concentrating domestic stocks of gold in the central banks, and the restrictions for many years placed on trade in foreign monies have operated so that the total supplies of hoarded good money have long been insufficient to permit a smooth development of monetary circulation during the early days and weeks after the collapse of the paper note standard. Some time must elapse before the amount of foreign money needed in domestic trade is obtained by the sale of stocks and commodities, by raising credit, and by withdrawing balances from abroad. In the meantime, people will have to make out with various kinds of emergency money tokens. In the early fall of 1923, several institutions sprang up spontaneously that would lead Germany on the path to replacing the mark. In October, the Hamburger Bank started issuing notes covered by foreign exchange, and a similar bank was set up in Kiel. Meanwhile, preparations were made in the Rhineland to establish a bank on a gold standard. The disintegration of the German economy into several currency areas was imminent, but history took a different course. In early August, Karl Helfferich had presented the government with a rescue plan. Helfferich's idea was to create new confidence among the population that the decline of the mark had reached its limit. His strategy was based entirely on speculations about the layman's monetary psychology. Helfferich proposed to establish a new bank, to be called the Rentenbank, endowed with a claim to 3,200 million marks, backed up by all commercial assets in Germany. Thus, all German firms, including farmers and banks, were said to have a collective liability to the Rentenbank. The Rentenbank would then issue Rentenmarks. In the mind of the average German citizen, the Rentenmark, founded on value-stable soil, had successfully stopped the further erosion of the mark. But the end of the crisis had a very different source. On the same day the first Rentenmarks came into circulation, the printing of new marks was halted, as Mises had emphasized in his report to the Verein für Sozialpolitik. The first precondition of any monetary reform is to halt the printing press. Mises believed it was also necessary to bring about a return to gold, advocating a 100% marginal gold standard. The expression 100% marginal gold standard is, I believe, Professor Philipp Nataf's. These two measures were intimately connected. Together, they were designed to drive the government out of the monetary arena. He explained, "The reason for using commodity money is precisely to prevent political influence from affecting the value of the monetary unit. Gold is not the standard money merely on account of its brilliance or other physical and chemical characteristics, but because the increase or decrease of its quantity is dependent of any orders issued by political powers. The crucial function of the gold standard is that it makes changes in the quantity of money subject to the laws determining the profitability of gold production." Yet which particular type of gold standard did Mises have in mind? Apparently, he believed that a full-blown gold standard which involved the circulation of gold coins was not necessary or advisable under present circumstances. He also believed that a gold exchange standard in which the currency consists exclusively of fractional reserve banknotes was acceptable if bank laws strictly limited the issuance of these banknotes. His pre-war studies had already alerted him to the likelihood that fractional reserve banknotes would be issued on a growing scale, and that there was no natural limit to this type of inflation if it proceeded slowly, in a step-by-step manner. His 1923 proposal therefore advocated 100% reserves for all additional note issues. Mises's plan thus took the present existence of fractional reserve notes as irreversible, and focused instead on the prevention of any further issuance of such notes. All additional issues must be completely covered by gold deposited with the issuing bank. The foundation and cornerstone of the provisional new monetary system will be the absolute prohibition of the issue of any notes not completely covered by gold. The amount of Reichsbank banknotes, of the Darlehenkassen, of emergency currency of any kind, and of token money will be legislated to be, after deduction of the stocks of gold and of foreign exchange held by the Reichsbank and by the private banks of issue, the maximum amount of German notes in circulation. Any extension of this maximum must be avoided under any circumstances except for the facilitation of end-of-quarter payments that we already have mentioned. Any note issue beyond this limit must be fully covered by a deposit of gold or of foreign exchange with the Reichsbank. This is obviously the adoption of the main provision of Peel's Bank Act, with all its deficiencies, but for the moment these deficiencies hardly have any practical significance. Our present goal is merely to abolish inflation by stopping the printing press. The objective which alone we presently strive for is best served through a prohibition of note issues without metallic backing. The deficiencies alludes to concern the absence of legal limitations on checking accounts and other money substitutes. To determine the most suitable redemption ratio between gold and the currency, Mises recommended that the monetary authority should proceed by 1. Stopping the printing press, and then 2. Letting the exchange rate between its currency and gold stabilize on the market. In short, stop inflating, and then let the market determine the gold value of the mark. Mises maintained the same views on the technical aspects of monetary reform for the rest of his career. In 1953, he made the case for a 100% marginal gold standard in a more detailed and thorough manner when he added a 4th section to the English edition of the Theory of Money and Credit. But the 1953 Mises plan was substantially the same plan he first presented in 1923. Mises rejected the idea, which would later be maintained by the influential Gustav Cassel, that there might not be enough gold available to put all countries in the world on a gold standard. Mises argued that the pricing process would always equilibrate demand and supply. Moreover, he observed that the global gold supply had increased since 1914, and that trade had decreased, so that there was no great danger of lower than 1914 prices. Finally, it was not necessary to bring about a full-blown gold circulation. A return to the gold standard would not necessarily mean a return to the actual use of gold money for small and medium-sized payments within the country. For even the gold exchange standard developed by Ricardo in his work Proposals for an Economical and Secure Currency, 1816, is a true and sound gold standard. The monetary history of the recent decades has clearly shown this. Following Ricardo further, he even suggested legislating that the Reichsbank only be obliged to redeem gold ingots rather than gold coins. This would act as an effective deterrent against redemption demands that the bank might not be able to comply with in its first years of operation under the gold standard. At some later point it might, however, be useful to counteract the note-using habits of the population, and thus to replace the note circulation by an effective gold circulation in order to prevent future overissuance of banknotes. It turned out that Mises's apprehensions about the remaining inflation dangers in a gold exchange standard were justified. Writing many years later in Human Action, he regretted the moderate stance he had taken in his earlier writings because it left too much power in the hands of the government, which, through its monetary authority, still issued the gold exchange currency. He denounced the root error behind the gold exchange standard, which was in seeing the costs involved in the preservation of a metallic currency as a waste. This had been the mistake of both Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and thus enjoyed immense credibility and prestige. Yet Mises had come to consider it as one of the most serious shortcomings of the classical economists. In dealing with the problems of the gold exchange standard, all economists, including the author of this book, failed to realize that it places in the hands of government the power to manipulate their nation's currency easily. Economists blithely assumed that no government of a civilized nation would use the gold exchange standard intentionally as an instrument of inflationary policy. Mises's case for the restoration of the gold standard was obviously based on the premise that an inflation-free monetary order would be a good thing. But what if someone objected to this view on fiscal grounds? These conditional inflationists, as Mises called them, admitted that inflation was not necessary to equilibrate the balance of payments. But they held that in some situations it was suitable and expedient for the government to use inflation as a particular form of taxation. Mises observed that paper money production was indeed one of three possible resources of government revenue, the other two being taxation and borrowing. In his view, economic science could not determine which of these techniques should be used, but it had a few things to say about the social and economic consequences of paper money inflation, and also about its political significance. Mises suggested that inflation was by its very nature undemocratic. A government always feels compelled to resort to inflationary measures when it is unable to issue bonds and when it does not dare to increase taxes, because it fears to lose support for its system of government if the latter's financial and general economic consequences become obvious too quickly. Thus, inflation becomes one of the most important psychological instruments of an economic policy bent on camouflaging its effects. In this sense, it may be called a tool of anti-democratic policy because it makes it possible, through the deception of public opinion, to perpetuate a system of government which would have no prospect of public approval if all things were openly explained. Mises here rediscovers a fact that had been first stressed in the writings of Nicolas Orem, a 14th century scholastic and author of the very first monetary treatise. Orem pointed out that debasement, the inflation technique of his age, served to enrich the princes at the expense of the community. The princes thereby turned from kings into tyrants. I am of the opinion that the main and final cause why the prince pretends to the power of altering the coinage is the profit or gain which he can get from it. The amount of the prince's profit is necessarily that of the community's loss, but whatever loss the prince inflicts on the community is injustice, and the act of a tyrant, and not of a king, as Aristotle says. And so the prince would be at length able to draw to himself almost all the money or riches of his subjects, and reduce them to slavery. And this would be tyrannical, indeed true and absolute tyranny, as it is represented by philosophers and in ancient history. Recalling the intimate relationship between the welfare state and the warfare state, a relationship emphasized by the 19th century free trade movement of Cobden, Bright and Bastille, Mises stressed that the inflationist mindset, which also underlies proposals in favor of seemingly moderate conditional inflation, is not an isolated phenomenon, but part and parcel of the reigning ideology. Inflationism belongs to imperialism, to militarism, to protectionism, to statism, to socialism, in the same way as the sound money policy of the champions of the gold standard had belonged to liberalism, to free trade, and to pacifism. And just as the global catastrophe that has swept over mankind since 1914 is not an elementary fact of nature, but the necessary consequence of the ideas that rule our times, so is the destruction of our monetary system nothing but the necessary consequence of the dominance of certain ideologies of monetary policy. A few months after the stabilization of the mark, the position of the banks and other private firms that depended on continued inflation in Germany had become untenable, and they started scrambling for cash. Many went under, the most prominent case being the Biedermann Bank, whose president was Josef Schumpeter. In the interwar period, the large Austrian banks had consciously sought to win economists of Schumpeter's standing as front men to reassure their creditors from abroad. They had also asked Mises for support several times, but he always rejected these proposals because he thought the commercial banks were all bankrupt. He probably could have increased his revenue several times, if it is licit to extrapolate pre-World War I data. Indeed, before the war, the leading executives of the Kreditanstalt Spitzmüller and of the Bodenkreditanstalt Sieghart had a basic annual income of 50,000 kronen, whereas civil servants of the rank of Mises attained in the 1920s, Ministerialrat, earned 12,000 kronen. This was not a pose. He had in fact always kept his personal account with Austria's Postal Savings Bank. Theory of money and credit reconsidered. Sometime before March 1923, Mises had talked to representatives of Duncker and Humboldt about a second edition of Theorie des Geldes und der Umlaufsmittel. He planned to incorporate several major necessary additions, but intended to make cuts elsewhere in order to maintain the overall size of the book. He rejected the first offer as insufficient, both financially and because it stipulated that he cut the book by 1/6. He pointed out that the contract concerning the first edition, which eventually sold out entirely, had been unfavorable to him since he did not even recover his expenses. Eventually, he signed a contract on May 31st, 1923 that stipulated a production of 2,000 plus 50 complimentary copies and 150 for review. Mises had Duncker und Humboldt send 14 of the 50 complimentary copies directly to the recipients. He himself distributed the remaining 36 copies. Although the message of the first edition was unaltered in its essentials, he felt obliged to take account of various recent developments in economic theory, as well as changes in his own views, most notably his new perspective on the economics of socialism. He also wanted to further develop the theory of interest and business cycle theory, about which he now believed he had previously underestimated the significance of his own contribution. I have come to the conclusion that the theory which I put forward as an elaboration and continuation of the doctrines of the currency school is in itself a sufficient explanation of crises, and not merely a supplement to an explanation in terms of the theory of direct exchange, as I supposed in the first edition. He also added a section on current problems of banking policy, a chapter dealing with the monetary theory and policy of statism, and an essay on the classification of theories of money. He deleted long sections dealing with historical cases of hyperinflation. These passages had been necessary in 1912 at the end of a long phase of monetary stability to illustrate the possibility of inflationary dangers lurking around the corner if the policies of the day continued. In 1924 this was no longer necessary. The experiences of recent years afford sufficient illustrations of the fundamental argument to allow these discussions now to be dispensed with. Indeed, Germany's hyperinflation was a striking illustration of Mises's argument. Especially impressive were his predictions of inflation's social consequences, that is, the redistributive effects. All inflations entail redistribution to the benefit of those who received the new currency first, but the German inflation entailed redistribution on such a massive, visible scale that few could fail to notice it. While the personal savings of most people had become worthless, some ruthless investors with good political connections had amassed great fortunes. Mises's anger about these events was not directed against those with political connections, but toward those who made such connections relevant to amassing such fortunes. A passage from an unpublished draft of his introduction to the second edition reveals his state of mind at the end of 1923. Reckoning with the leaders of the campaign of lies against his book, he states, "Between the first and second edition of this book, the European governments waged a war against economic science that was as tenacious as it was unsuccessful. It was the pitiable collapse of their politics that showed those in power the limits of their might. The statist theories have collapsed with the politics of statism, and economic science, long disdained, has reclaimed its place of honor. It was inevitable that the first edition of this book, although it only sought to serve the truth, was passionately, bitterly, and perfidiously attacked by the champions of the theories that prepared the way for monetary debacle." He had planned to give the new introduction the title, "The Place of the Theory of Money and Fiduciary Media within the System of Theoretical Economics," but also abandoned this idea. At the end of March 1924, the last part of the manuscript was in the hands of the publisher, and Dunkel und Humblot worked feverishly toward completion of the printing in the summer semester. The first paperback copies were finally ready in the second week of July, and the book bindery delivered the hardcover copies on July 18th. From the start, the book sold exceedingly well for a theoretical treatise, especially one that opposed mainstream views on its subject. In 1932, Dunkel und Humblot already talked about a third edition of the book, and in light of the sales, it is certain that this edition would have been forthcoming. The rise of National Socialism in Germany prevented this project. The success was not entirely surprising given Mises's new prominence as a member of Austria's first post-war government and author of Gemeinwirtschaft. The German hyperinflation and the enormous inflation in German Austria had seriously damaged the credibility of the established authorities. Professional economists and other social scientists were looking for other approaches. In this context, Weber's remark in his posthumous Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft that of all monetary theories, Mises's was the most acceptable, had directed the attention of a broader, learned readership to the work of this Austrian economist. German economists returned to classical liberalism. The second edition of Theorie des Geldes und der Umlaufsmittel arrived just in time for the annual meeting of the Verein für Sozialpolitik, which took place in late September 1924 in Stuttgart. It provided a welcome antidote to the German edition of John Maynard Keynes's tract on monetary reform, which Dunkel und Humblot had published some months before Mises's book. In his book, Keynes had adopted the position of Irving Fisher and Gustav Cassel, according to which monetary policy should strive to stabilize the purchasing power of money. Meanwhile, Germany's situation had improved considerably. In May, the revanchist Poincaré government had lost the general elections in France, and the new leadership under Herriot, Painlevé, and Briand immediately set out to bring about an end to the politics of seizure in the Ruhr. As a consequence, the German government was finally able to come to a financial agreement with its former enemies, and obtained even better conditions than Austria had in the Geneva Protocols 2 years earlier. Germany obtained Western credit for 800 million gold marks to bolster the reserves of the Reichsbank, and thus enable it to operate on a gold exchange standard. In contrast to Vienna, the Berlin government did not have to make any of the far-reaching concessions that would have diminished its political sovereignty. The agreement that was signed in London on August 16, 1924, on the basis of a report from U.S. envoy Charles Dawes, was, as all sides agreed, the first true intergovernmental agreement since the war. A level of optimism finally returned to the population. This apparently helped the German economists face up to the crisis of social policy that Weber and Mises had caused with their recent writings. The assembly in Stuttgart broke new ground in the history of the Verein für Sozialpolitik when, on the last 2 days of the meeting, the great majority of the speakers endorsed, with some qualifications, the case for free trade. This ended the more than 50-year-old tradition of monolithic advocacy of the welfare state, inflation, and protectionism. 2 years before, at the 50th anniversary convention in Eisenach, Mises' friend Georg Hahn had unsuccessfully agitated for the transformation of the Verein into a pure research association. Two motivations seem to be at work in this attempt. On the one hand, Max Weber's ideal of a value-free social science had won many followers among the younger generation. On the other hand, the socialist November revolutions of 1918 had produced a political radicalization of its members and of the larger society. This radicalization diminished the status of the middle-of-the-road mainstream, which in the past had been the main agent of political compromise within the Verein and of its application in government policy. The debate had been put on the schedule at the very last minute. Two considerations came into play. First, in January 1925, the German government was going to recover its sovereignty in matters of foreign trade. It had been denied this freedom by the Treaty of Versailles. Second, the Dawes Plan had finally created a reliable basis for policy making. True to its mission, the Verein sought to give intellectual guidance to the forthcoming parliamentary debates, though it was impossible to commission any research papers before the Stuttgart meeting. Herkner's choice of the invited speakers was therefore bound to set the tone for the entire debate. He chose four well-established economists, who he knew to be open to free trade: Max Ehring, Christian Eckert, Bernhard Harms, and Georg Gothein. At the meeting, these men did indeed call on the German government to pioneer the re-establishment of global free trade, but Gothein and Ehring argued that some tariffs should be kept in place, not as a protection for certain industries, but as the basis of future international negotiations to enhance further the freedom of trade. These statements were so well received that 107 participants went on to sign a proclamation of university professors calling for free trade. Mises' friend Georg Jahn expressed the significance of the event in a 1927 essay on the free trade movement in Germany. The new free trade initiatives have found expression in a proclamation that was agreed upon in Stuttgart, 1924, in the wake of a meeting of the Verein für Sozialpolitik dealing with the reform of trade policy, and which was signed by a great number of academic economists. The proclamation says, Germany's new economic structure, the implications of the London Agreement, and important changes in the forces cooperating on the world market have confronted Germany with an entirely new trade political situation. The undersigned representatives of the economic and social sciences, among them many who before the war had advocated the basic principles of then protectionist German trade policy, emphasize that under current conditions, Germany is forced to make the advantages of world trade its own, most notably in order to rationalize its agriculture and its industry. Hence they can concur with industrial and agrarian tariffs only to the extent that these are necessary and adequate means to make international trade more liberal. Jahn went on, what these academic economists demand is nothing less than restoration of trade policy to the free trade ideas of the 19th century. Major parts of agriculture and industry might continue to be in need of protection, but the greater interest of the state is in free trade, and not in the conservation of a system of protective tariffs which increases rather than diminishes the problems. It was probably the most joyful experience that Mises ever had at a Verein meeting, even though he did not fully concur with all provisions of the proclamation. By the end of October 1924 he had not signed it. The events most certainly took him by surprise. Returning from his summer vacation in Bad Gastein, Mises had spent only a couple of days in Vienna and then travelled to Stuttgart. He did not plan to take part in the discussions, but eventually gave in to the demands of the other participants who rightly saw in him one of the main driving forces behind the apparent new orientation. Mises spoke from notes consisting of keywords. He later developed these notes into two manuscripts that he sent to the Verein's manager, Franz Böse, who handled the publication of the proceedings. Thus, in a comment he made after the trade sessions, when the convention had turned to problems of currency and inflation, Mises observed that the meeting had featured remarkable progress toward a demercantilizing of economic thought. Protectionist ideas had lost much, if not all, of their old attractiveness for this group, and it is not different in the field of monetary theory. All advocates of the state theory of money have disappeared, and some who not long ago advocated abolishing the gold standard now advocate calculation in gold and the gold standard. He also took a shot at those who, like Alfred Schmidt-Essen, in those days an influential writer on monetary questions, claimed that the gold standard is a monetary order in the exclusive interest of the United States and England. Turning this argument on its head, Mises said, "It was not a foreign commodity that depreciated our currency, but a foreign doctrine. The fight against and the rejection of the quantity theory that we accepted with a banking theory." Then he recollected the story of how, on an evening 3 years earlier, he walked with a German visitor through the streets of Vienna. While most factories stood silent or had significantly reduced their operations, only the printing presses of the Austro-Hungarian Bank were busy. Things had definitely improved. The inflation had been stopped, and the party of inflation and its theories, most notably the banking theory of money, had lost much of their authority. At the Verein meeting, Mises's views did not encounter any serious resistance. Melchior Pali merely objected that his criticism of the banking theory had gone too far. The only view that Mises himself opposed was Felix Sommerlich's contention that monetary reform was a matter of constitutional amendment. Anticipating a tenet of the late 20th century school of constitutional economics, Sommerlich claimed that monetary stability was essentially a legal issue that could be solved through a suitable monetary constitution that limited the powers of the central bank management. Mises objected that this approach does not get to the root of the problem, namely the inflationist mindset. Ultimately, central bank policies are determined by ideas, not by legal codes. Criticizing the effectiveness of monetary policy, Mises also seemed to advance an early version of the rational expectations argument. He stressed that he did not want to argue that future inflation would be prevented by more enlightened monetary authorities. His point was rather that economic enlightenment of the general public would deny inflationary monetary policy any effect. As soon as the public became aware of falling exchange rates, everybody would turn to smuggling, at which point the government could not finance itself by printing banknotes. Silver linings on the horizon. The successful second edition of the Theorie des Geldes and the reorientation of the Verein für Sozialpolitik were symptoms of a changed intellectual and political climate that came into full swing after 1923, the year of the crisis of social policy and of the stabilization of the mark. Central to both events were Mises's writings. This fact did not reach the attention of the larger public, but was obvious to all leading circles in academia and in monetary policy. His impact in those years was limited primarily by his deficiencies as a communicator. He was not an orator and lacked the charismatic personality to win over an audience. He had a fine and dry wit, but was often too subtle for those outside Europe's higher society. And when he gave talks in foreign languages, his wit abandoned him. He certainly was not at ease in French or English. His accent was strong when speaking English, and his French, although significantly better, was far from perfect. Who knows what turn the history of the 1920s might have taken, had Mises enjoyed the communicative gifts of a Maynard Keynes, an Irving Fisher, a Werner Sombart, or an Ottmar Spann. Still, Mises did have a significant impact. After 1924, he became a sought-after speaker, and also after 1925, the official representative of the Austrian Chambers of Commerce at the International Chamber of Commerce. These meetings and the connections he was building at the London School of Economics provided Mises with the opportunity to disseminate his views throughout Europe. Next week I will travel to Brussels, to the Chamber of Commerce convention, and then to London, where I will again look up my English friends. I have great expectations for the visit, even if I can only stay in London for a short time. He was a vocal champion of a return to a gold standard. His efforts were crowned with the introduction of a gold exchange standard in Austria. It was only a gold exchange standard, a fractional reserve system with a lower reserve ratio than its predecessor, the classical gold standard, but at least notionally gold was once again the money of the country. The new gold-based currency, the shilling, replaced the krone on January 1st, 1925. The conversion rate was 10,000 kronen for 1 shilling. The krone had been introduced in 1892 in substitution for the golden banknotes, which, however, circulated during the next few years. The substitution process was ended by January 1st, 1900. Little Austria thus spearheaded a movement that came into full swing when Great Britain returned to gold a few months later, on April 25th. In many ways, this reform paralleled the 1892 reform that had first introduced the krone, itself a gold-based currency. Both reforms enjoyed the decisive support of Austrian economists. Just as the original krone could be called the brainchild of Karl Menger, so the original shilling was the fruit of Mises's labor. In the preceding year, Mises had been given a prominent forum to explain and justify the necessity of the reform. He did so in a widely publicized lecture that he delivered to the annual plenary meeting of an association of German industrialists in the new Czechoslovakian Republic. Mises made the case that the return to the gold standard was the most pressing problem of present-day monetary policy. The name of the association was Deutscher Hauptverband der Industrie. The meeting took place at the association's headquarters in Teplitz on March 15, 1924. Mises might have given a similar talk to the Association of Merchants and Industrialists in Berlin, Verein Berliner Kaufleute und Industrieller. A local newspaper had been given a long abstract of his manuscript, based on which it presented on the same evening a detailed report on the meeting and Mises's speech. The story was picked up by all major newspapers of the former empire and widely publicized. Eventually the full speech was published as Present-Day Questions of Financial and Monetary Policy. The circumstances of this appearance are interesting in that they give a taste of the conditions under which Mises had to operate in those days. The secretary of the association, a certain Dr. Janowski, had approached Mises to give a talk on present-day problems of public finance and monetary policy. When Mises chose the title Return to the Gold Standard, the main problem of present-day monetary policy, Janowski feared the speech would seem irrelevant to people interested in practical affairs. He also feared that Mises's remarks would be too controversial. The meetings of the association did attract considerable attention among political circles in Czechoslovakia and neighboring countries, and statements from the keynote speakers were commonly interpreted as reflecting the official position of the association. According to Janowski, the association had not yet come to a firm opinion on the question of Czechoslovakian monetary policy. Janowski mentioned, however, that the last resolution the association passed on monetary questions had endorsed the policies advocated by John Maynard Keynes, who opposed the return to pre-war parities for all strongly depreciated currencies. He did not mention that he himself was an advocate of banking theory-style economic policies and had engaged in infights with local admirers of Mises, such as Fritz Wolfram. Janowski later became a Misesian. See his February 3, 1932 letter to Mises, in which he criticizes the currency proposal of a certain Jelinek as not conducive to the aims he has set himself. In the fall of 1932, Janowski gave a speech before the Gesellschaft Österreichischer Volkswirte. Mises was instrumental in arranging this talk. Mises criticized the reform proposals of Keynes, Josiah Stamp, and Fischer as overrating the usefulness of price indices to measure the value of money. He stressed that the great advantage of the gold standard was not any sort of value stability, but rather its independence from the political process. The pre-war decline in the purchasing power of gold had not resulted from the production of this metal, but from the production of fiduciary media. Whatever its deficiencies, the gold standard was superior to government-managed money. For Mises, 1925 also brought a significant breakthrough on an entirely different level. He finally met the woman who would become his wife. Margot Cellini had been one of 6 guests at a dinner party held by Fritz Kaufmann, a young lawyer and member of Mises's private seminar. It is almost a miracle that Mises won the heart of the lady sitting next to him, for he spent most of the meal discussing economics. On the other hand, his preoccupation gave her the opportunity to observe him. This is how she perceived him. What impressed me were his beautiful, clear blue eyes, always concentrated on the person to whom he talked, never shifting away. His dark hair, already a little greyish at the sides, was parted, not one hair out of place. I liked his hands. his long slim fingers, which clearly showed that he did not use them for manual work. He was dressed with quiet elegance. A dark custom-made suit, a fitting silk necktie, his posture indicated that he must have been a former army officer. This book is, as the author correctly points out, the only available testimony on Mises, the man, from a first-hand source, but its statements are not fully reliable, as two examples show. First, the author lied about her age, claiming to be 6 years younger than she really was. Even on her gravestone, the birth year is incorrectly given as 1896. Her correct birth year is stated in her marriage certificate as well as in U.S. immigration paperwork as 1890. Second, Margit states that she was the only woman he wanted to marry from the first moment he met her. While this statement might be true, the following sentence, in which she claims that Ludwig never changed his feelings or his mind about this decision, is demonstrably wrong, as we will see in a later chapter. These examples show that Margot von Mises's biographical recollections must be read with caution. The present work uses her statements only where other evidence does not contradict them. He talked to her after dinner, and they went to a dance club. Apparently Mises was a poor dancer, at least by Margot's standards, and so they spent most of the night talking. Actually, she did most of the talking, and he listened attentively. Margot was an attractive woman of 5'4", with brown hair and grey-blue eyes. Now, as they talked, he discovered she was also a witty and warm person. He must have fallen in love with her that evening. The next day, he sent her red roses and asked her out for dinner. It was the first of many such dinners over the next 2 years. Margot Cellini was an actress from a bourgeois background in Hamburg. During the war, she had performed on one of the leading stages in Vienna, the Deutsches Volkstheater. When Mises met her, she was 35 years old and a very attractive widow with 2 children, Guido and Gitta. Shortly after her arrival in Vienna in early 1917, she had married Ferdinand Sereny, a Hungarian aristocrat who died in 1923, bequeathing to her assets that had lost most of their value during the inflation. Characteristically, Mises was cautious, even when his feelings might have threatened to overwhelm him. Could he trust an actress? As Margit later pointed out, most people in polite society considered actresses to be high-class call girls. Ludwig seems to have shared this prejudice. At any rate, he took precautions. As he later confessed to his wife, he had checked some of her statements about her professional development by consulting the records in the archives of the Neue Freie Presse. He probably also talked to his cousin Rudolf Strisower, who had been Ferdinand Sereny's physician. These investigations confirmed Margit's version of things. But there were more fundamental obstacles that hampered the development of their romance. On the one hand, Ludwig's mother Adele had great reservations about Margit. Actually, none of his girlfriends had ever met with her approval. She must have imagined a different sort of wife for her beloved son, and her opinion had a great weight for Ludwig, especially since he held certain philosophical views that would have deterred him from marriage anyway. These concerned the nature of marriage and the possibility of being both a husband and a scholar. A thoroughly unromantic passage from Socialism says it all. As a social institution, marriage is an adjustment of the individual to the social order, by which a certain field of activity, with all its tasks and requirements, is assigned to him. Exceptional natures, whose abilities lift them far above the average, cannot support the coercion which such an adjustment to the way of life of the masses must involve. The man who feels within himself the urge to devise and achieve great things, who is prepared to sacrifice his life rather than be false to his mission, will not stifle his urge for the sake of a wife and children. In the life of a genius, however loving, the woman and whatever goes with her occupy a small place. We do not speak here of those great men in whom sex was completely sublimated and turned into other channels, Kant for example, or of those whose fiery spirit, insatiable in the pursuit of love, could not acquiesce in the inevitable disappointments of married life, and hurried, with restless urge, from one passion to another. Even the man of genius, whose married life seems to take a normal course, whose attitude to sex does not differ from that of other people, cannot in the long run feel himself bound by marriage without violating his own self. Genius does not allow itself to be hindered by any consideration for the comfort of its fellows, even of those closest to it. The ties of marriage become intolerable bonds, which the genius tries to cast off, or at least to loosen so as to be able to move freely. The married couple must walk side by side amid the rank and file of humanity. Whoever wishes to go his own way must break away from it. Rarely indeed is he granted the happiness of finding a woman willing and able to go with him on his solitary path. Mises's treatment of the genius was anticipated by George Bernard Shaw in his Earning a Living and Creative Work. Mises did not know this passage from Shaw at the time. 25 years later, a German correspondent pointed out the parallel. This passage survived all editions of the book. Ludwig was slow to allow Margit onto his hitherto solitary path. But on the other hand, he was longing for the love of a true companion. Margit later surmised that a deep-seated dissatisfaction with his entirely public life was the true cause of his infamous temper. The most terrible outbursts he reserved for the woman he loved. His temper was as astonishing as it was frightening. Occasionally he showed terrible outbursts of tantrums. I do not really know what else to call them. Suddenly his temper would flare up, mostly about a small, unimportant happening. He would lose control of himself, start to shout and say things which, coming from him, were so unexpected, so unbelievable, that when it happened the first few times, I was frightened to death. Whatever I said would enrage him even more. It was impossible to reason with him. After a few years of married life, however, he became much more reasonable and less easy to anger.